the humid pine woods of northern Louisiana, deep behind the old parish lines, there once stood an institution few dared speak of, Saint Albion School for Girls, established in 1892 as a place of spiritual education and preparation. It was described publicly as a retreat for the devout but only whispered about as a prison for the forgotten. 31 girls were enrolled. Between 1895 and 1906, all of them took final vows. All of them were said to have Wednesday the Lord. None of them were ever seen again. No graves, no funeral records, just their names, handwritten in pale ink across aging parchment. And a strange pattern: every girl left a final letter before her marriage. Each began with the same line: I heard his voice through the walls. No clergy remained at Saint Albion. The building itself was razed in 1931, but in a locked drawer of the Pine Hollow Parish Archive, a ledger was discovered, faded and stained with candle wax. It contained a single marginal note, dated 1907. The girls did not go missing. They were taken underground. In 1895, Saint Albion School for Girls was formally consecrated on 13 acres of reclaimed land in northern Louisiana. The property, thick with pine shadows and Spanish moss, had once served as a Confederate field hospital during the last years of the Civil War, but most had forgotten its bloody past. By the turn of the century, it had been quietly acquired by the Archdiocese of New Orleans and repurposed as a cloistered educational retreat. Publicly, it was known as a finishing school for the pious. Privately, it was called many things, none of them flattering. The school accepted only girls between the ages of 11 and 15. Most came from distant corners of the state. Their families promised a future of spiritual refinement and sacred discipline. The location was remote, with no nearby settlements, and only a narrow gravel road leading to its entrance. Few visitors came after the initial drop-off, and even fewer left with anything tangible to say about what went on inside. The nuns who ran the facility rarely traveled into town. Supplies were delivered once a month and brought in under lock and prayer. From 1895 to 1906, 31 girls were documented as full-time residents of Saint Albion. They were listed not by full names but by first names only, written in tight, curling cursive on yellow parchment in the parish registry. Each entry included 3 dates: arrival, confirmation, and final vow. No records of graduation, transfer, or death were ever attached. Instead, the final vow was treated as a point of no return. For every girl who passed through its wrought iron gates, her story ended with that vow. What was peculiar, at least to those who later reviewed the document, was the timing of the final vows. All 31 corresponded precisely with nights of astronomical new moons. These were the darkest nights of each month, when even starlight seemed reluctant to shine through the fog-draped canopy. Some speculated this alignment had symbolic meaning. Others found it troubling. Either way, there was no official explanation. Communication with families was limited and highly filtered. Letters were sent home, but they bore all the signs of institutional interference: identical handwriting, rigid phrasing, and the complete absence of personal detail. Most simply conveyed that the daughter was progressing in her devotion, that her soul was being shaped by the Word, and that she would be ready soon, ready for what was never explained. No photographs from within the school have ever been found. There were no portraits taken at the time of enrollment, no class pictures, no group photographs during feast days or confirmations. Even for Catholic institutions of the era, this silence of imagery was extreme. When questioned decades later, the Church offered no defense. The records, they claimed, had been misplaced in an administrative transfer. Among the families, questions began to mount after the 5th or 6th year. Daughters stopped writing. Some had never written at all. When parents attempted to visit, they were told their presence would disrupt the spiritual focus of the students. On rare occasions, They were allowed to walk the grounds but always escorted, and never permitted indoors. A few left offerings at the chapel steps. Most eventually stopped coming. The one name that surfaced again and again in the surviving documents was Celestine Durant. Born in 1888 in Saint Martinville, she was the only child of Amelia and Joseph Durant. After Joseph's death in 1898, Amelia sent Celestine to Saint Albion in 1902, trusting in the guidance of the church and the promise of a divine calling. But over the next 2 years, Amelia received only 2 letters, each more vague than the last. The third year brought nothing. In 1906, after hearing nothing further, Amelia began writing weekly to the abbess. She requested updates, asked permission to visit, and finally demanded proof of her daughter's well-being. No response came. R1910. Amelia had written to the diocese directly. She enclosed all her previous letters, along with copies of Celestine's baptism and confirmation. She asked for a burial certificate, or at least a signed acknowledgement of her daughter's fate. Again, there was no reply. The only return correspondence she received was a generic leaflet on grief and surrender to divine will. She died in 1919. Her daughter's name was never spoken from a pulpit again. The silence surrounding Saint Albion deepened as the years went on. Girls disappeared from public memory as surely as they vanished behind the convent's thick wooden doors. No one ever saw them leave. No wagons rolled out bearing trunks or farewells. No announcements were made at local parishes. Their exits were as quiet as snowfall on an empty road. Later, some would say the girls had been relocated to foreign missions. Others claimed they had fallen ill and passed on within the walls. But no one could produce a grave. No death certificates surfaced, and none of the churches overseas records one finally reviewed contained the names of any Saint Albion alumnae. What did exist were the final vow entries. Each girl, one by one, was recorded as having taken her sacred marriage to God. The language was strangely formal, more akin to nuptial announcements than profession of faith. Married in spirit to the bridegroom, followed by the date and an initialed signature from the abbess. Most of these entries were accompanied by a short Latin phrase, often scribbled in a different hand. Wa, repeated for times across the ledger. Read, sponsi in aeternum brides in eternity. By the time investigators examined the site decades later, the ledger's ink had faded, the parchment had yellowed, and the questions had multiplied. But one thing remained unchanged. 31 girls entered Saint Albion, took their vows, and were never seen again. The foundations of Saint Albion concealed more than stone and timber. Beneath the main chapel, built on the elevated bones of a Civil War infirmary, existed a substructure, whose blueprints were omitted from public record. Buried beneath 13 feet of packed soil and sanctified marble, it stretched in a serpentine formation that wrapped beneath the east and south wings. Early architectural surveys, discovered only years later in diocesan archives, included references to auxiliary rooms listed under names that hinted more at function than design. Among them, quiet chambers, hydrotherapy, and retreat cells. These were not terms typically found in convent construction. Hydrotherapy suggested medical application, though no records from the school's operational years mentioned illness among the girls. Quiet chambers was even more vague, evoking both prayer and punishment, and the phrase retreat cells carried the unmistakable weight of solitary confinement. The plans showed no stairwells from the living quarters, only a narrow descending passage behind the altar, itself accessible, perhaps, only by clergy. By the turn of the century, the lower level had already faded into rumor. The nuns no longer spoke of it. New novitiates, brought in from other orders, were instructed to remain above ground. The official explanation was that the basement suffered a collapse during renovations in 1905. but the stonework above showed no signs of compromise. There were no insurance filings, no construction permits, just a line in the convent ledger dated September 3rd. Lower floor sealed, access revoked under bishop's order. Outside the school, however, stories persisted. Locals, who lived in the bayous east of the property, spoke of strange acoustics during evening mass. Several described hearing dull, rhythmic knocks echoing up through the chapel tunnels, as though someone below were hammering from beneath the earth. Others claimed to have heard distant, chanting Latin, they thought, or something older, wetter with vowels. One farmer swore that his daughters refused to walk past the perimeter after dusk, saying the trees themselves whispered near the fence line. And one Sunday, in 1903, a young altar server reportedly fainted at the pulpit. When revived, he said only that something had screamed beneath his feet. That altar server was never seen again at the chapel. The groundskeeper during the later years, a man named Lionel Dufour, kept no journal of his work, but his grandson, Henri, provided a statement during a 1971 diocesan inquiry. Henri claimed that Lionel had been instructed to salt the thresholds of the chapel once a month and to check the locks on the undercroft doors. No such doors were visible from any of the main floors. Lionel never spoke of what he found, only that you don't want to know what a holy room sounds like when it weeps. When the church sealed the basement, he was instructed to stack bricks across a narrow corridor behind the apse, then paint over the archway with lime wash. Henri remembered his grandfather's hands smelled of rust and sulfur for days afterward. The existence of these subterranean rooms was nearly forgotten until 1928, when an accidental fire led to a city-mandated survey of the ruins. The blaze, ignited by lightning, had gutted much of the east wing. A fire marshal named Elias Roby was sent to assess the stability of the remaining stone. His report, filed with the Louisiana State Fire Board, included a single handwritten note in the margin. Discovered bricked arch beneath rubble, evidence of a sealed corridor. Odor present, damp clay, wax, and what may have been burned wool. No official follow-up was made. What Roby found or claimed to was a rusted iron door behind collapsed masonry, slightly ajar. It bore no handle. The corridor beam was narrow, lined with old stone that had sweated through the years. The smell reminded him of forgotten root. Cellars earthy, dense, and unnaturally cold. The ceiling was low, and the air lacked movement. No light penetrated the shaft beam. He described it as a passage built to keep something in, not out. There was no documentation of what, if anything, lay beyond that door. Years later, a team of preservationists hired to reclaim the site uncovered partial teeling in the chapel floor thicker than standard, as if reinforced. Beneath it, they found what seemed to be a second flooring layer, charred at the edges and warped in sections, as though heat or pressure had forced something upward. No items were recovered from below, but a metal drainage grate placed strangely near the altar showed signs of having been pried open and resealed multiple times. What liquid had passed through it was no longer traceable, but its rust lines stained the marble in branching red patterns. During the school's years of operation, no girls were ever housed underground, or so the church claimed, but the schedule of daily activity documented by surviving ledgers always left an on 2-hour gap, each Sunday between dusk and compline. This window, unnamed and unassigned, was listed in records as processio silence. No explanation of that phrase was offered in any known instruction manual or liturgical guide. It simply occupied the same time slot week after week for 11 years. Some now speculate that it was during this time that select girls were led beneath the floor, perhaps for final vows, perhaps for something else. The lack of written accounts from the girls themselves makes such speculation difficult to prove. Yet one troubling notation survives in a folded letter found inside the bindings of a ruined hymnal, hidden between its glued spine and the last page of Psalms. The handwriting, Small and uneven, reads only. They do not kneel when they enter, they descend. The paper bore no signature. The ink had nearly vanished, but on the reverse, faintly visible under heat, was a single phrase in Latin, Ut silentium fiat. Let there be silence. By early spring of 1903, the grounds of Saint Albion began to shift in rhythm. The weeks leading up to March were marked by unusual preparations. Boxes of beeswax candles arrived in silence. Cloister doors remained locked longer, and the school's stone fountain, a normally stagnant basin in the garden, was drained and scrubbed with lye by the younger novitiates. The convent's liturgical calendar, still surviving in brittle fragments, included a single phrase penned in the margins of Lent, Ceremonia Lucis, or the Ceremony of Light. It was scheduled for March 21st, always at midnight, always beneath the new moon. Officially, it was presented as a vigil, a devotion held in darkness, symbolic of faith enduring through trial, yet no witnesses from the surrounding parish were ever permitted to attend. The few who asked were told the ritual was one of cloistered obedience, reserved for the girls alone and sanctioned by the Mother Superior and her spiritual advisor, a man known only in signed ledgers as Directorum L. Only fragments remained to suggest what actually transpired. Among them, the half-burned diary of a novitiate named Elora Matthew, who arrived in 1902 from an orphanage near Lake Charles. Her writing was careful, marked by the penmanship taught in ecclesiastical schools, but scattered with smudges and irregular spacing, as though written in haste or fear. She referred to the weeks before the March event as the thinning days, during which the older girls no longer ate with the rest, and were instead summoned nightly to the abbt's chamber after vespers. Their return was silent, no eye contact, no conversation. Elora noted how the air around them smelled faintly of oil and stone. The diary describes a practice called the masking of the brides. Each girl selected was fitted with a linen veil stitched at the chin, concealing all but their eyes. The fabric was thick and sour-smelling, as if it had not been washed since previous use. A cymbalone she described as a small black animal, with 7 horns, was embroidered at the brow. No one spoke as the veils were distributed. When Elora asked what it meant, she was told only that the brides must see without being seen. The final pages of the diary detailed the preparation on the night itself. The girls were made to walk barefoot down the nave, each holding a candle pressed with red wax at its base. Their hands were not to shake. Any girl whose flame extinguished during the descent would not be permitted to continue. Elora passed. She noted how the steps to the chapel floor seemed colder than before, as if the stone had been sunk in water. A hymn was sung in a key she had never heard, dissonant, almost Eastern, and repeated without translation. At the altar, a brass ring embedded in the stone was lifted. Beneath it lay the shaft into the substructure. Elora described the passage as choked with soot and warm air. The walls were wet. She was the fourth to descend. She recalled the scent, candle smoke, and something she called milk gone to bone. The hollow room, as she called it, was rectangular, with low ceilings and stone channels along the floor. She wrote that her candle flickered violently upon entry, though there was no draught. At the center stood a figure dressed in white, robes of no visible seam, sleeves to the wrists, and a mask carved from ashwood, blank except for 2 almond-shaped holes, and a symbol at the crown resembling the lamp she had seen before. The figure spoke a single word. Elora did not recognize the language. She phonetically attempted to reproduce it achlorimal and said. The syllables made her feel nauseous. The word echoed in her skull even after the man fell silent. All the girls knelt. Their candles were taken from them. The man raised a single hand and each flame died in unison. The room went black. She described a noisy subterranean, rumbling, like water pulled through pipes or a furnace stoking itself awake. The floor shook once, subtly, then came silence. The next entry in her diary was dated the following evening. She remembered returning to her bed, but not the walk back. Her veil was gone. Her candle stub was burned all the way down to the wick, though she did not recall holding it after the lights went out. Her final words, they called it a marriage, but no vows were spoken, just one name, said by one who has no mouth. No further entries follow. Her name disappears from roll books by May 1904. That summer, a crate arrived from a textile workshop in Algiers parish. The invoice, folded and brittle, remains in diocesan archives. It listed 12 mourning veils, pure white linen, hemmed in black, with embroidered symbols, representing the Agnus Dei, Lamb of God carrying a banner marked with 7 stitches. The veils were not listed as replacements or liturgical supplies. They were marked ceremonial apparel consumed upon use. No explanation was offered for their purpose. The convent made no additional purchases from the workshop after 1904. By 1911, the ceremony of light had disappeared from all parish calendars, but a note in the personal papers of Bishop René Duchamp, dated March 22nd of that year, described a troubling dream. He wrote of girls with hollow faces standing in a circle underground, passing a single flame hand to hand, each mouthing a word they dared not speak aloud. His final line, underlined in red, reads simply, "The light does not reveal, it selects." He died 2 months later of heart paralysis. In the spring of 1906, the temperature in Saint Albion's upper dormitories began to fluctuate in unnatural ways. The nuns attributed it to drafts seeping through the century-old plaster or the rising humidity of early Louisiana summers. Yet the girls who slept in the East Corridor knew something was wrong. They began to report sounds at the creaks and moans of a shifting structure, but intelligible syllables, whispers too precise to be coincidence. The voices came not from outside, nor from the hallway, but from within the very walls themselves. The first to write about it was a girl named Isabel Thorne, age 15, admitted in 1903. Her surviving letter, recovered decades later among unsorted correspondence in a rural diocese archive, was addressed not to her parents but to an unnamed cousin in Mississippi. In neat, slanted penmanship she described waking in the night to the sound of chanting murmurs, like the hum of bees, but shaped into speech. She initially believed it to be a prayer vigil held downstairs, but upon sitting upright in her bed, she realized the sound came from behind the headboard through the wall, muffled and constant. Over the next nights, the voice grew clearer. At first, she believed it was the voice of the Lord. The tone was commending but not cruel, male but inhumanly smooth, like a liturgical echo made flesh. It spoke Latin phrases she recognized from Mass. Fiat voluntas tua, Domini miserere. Then came others she did not understand, fluid sentences in guttural French. And finally, fragments that matched no language she had ever heard. One phrase repeated often, ending each night's session, Vivil harash talm. Isabel confessed the experience to Sister Honorine, one of the older caretakers of the dormitory. The sister warned her never to speak of it again, but she was not alone. 3 more letters, each penned by girls in the same corridor and dated between 1905 and 1907, made veiled references to the singing walls and prayers that know your name. These letters were intercepted by convent staff, never delivered to the families. Only copies, preserved by a former secretary who fled the convent in 1913, survive today. The atmosphere in the dormitory turned heavy. Girls began to develop nosebleeds, migraines, and into cases, muteness lasting for days. One account noted a girl waking with her hair completely singed on one side, though no fire had occurred and her bedding remained intact. The rooms were blessed multiple times. Incense was burned nightly, but the voices remained. By late 1906, word reached the diocese in New Orleans. A young priest, Father Louis Marquand, was sent to observe and assess. His background in seminary included exposure to rare dialects and scriptural linguistics. He arrived under the pretense of conducting Lent confessions, but was given access to the dormitory after dark. He remained at Saint Albion for 5 nights. His journals do not survive, but one personal letter never mailed was discovered in 1964, hidden inside the lining of a hollow Bible in the attic of the Pine Hollow Rectory. It was addressed to Bishop Thibault and dated March 17, 1907. The ink had bled with moisture, but much of the text remained legible. Father Marchand wrote of an atmosphere of vigilance, claiming the walls themselves waited for him, and that each night he spent in the dormitory, the voice grew more intimate. He described the sound not as a hallucination or echo, but as an external presence, speaking to him. It called him by his birth name, Lucien. It recited psalms, then altered theme, twisting them subtly, making them refer not to God but to some second light. One phrase, he claimed, translated roughly from what he believed was Enochian: "He who is beneath has no hands but yours." In the letter's final paragraph, Marchand abandoned theological framing entirely. He wrote that Saint Albion was not a convent. "It is a threshold," he said, "a door pretending to be a house of God. But doors swing 2 ways, and something has already stepped through." The letter ended abruptly. No signature, no final blessing. Father Marchand was never seen again. The convent claimed he had returned to New Orleans and died of fever en route. No burial record exists under his name. In the months that followed his disappearance, the East Corridor was closed indefinitely. A wall was constructed over the original dormitory entrance, leaving the wing sealed in plaster and brick. Sister Honorine, the last to reside there, was transferred to a silent order in Maine. Decades later, in 1949, a team sent to conduct an architectural survey of the decaying property noted an anomaly in the eastern wing. Their instruments detected hollow spaces behind what should have been a solid outer wall. When workers attempted to breach the plaster, their tools fractured, chisels snapped, drills stalled. The team reported a loud, low hum echoing from the site before the project was abandoned due to unexpected magnetic interference. None of them returned. The wall was left intact. Today, the East Corridor remains sealed. The plaster shows no cracks, yet those who approach it report a sensation of warm, subtle but persistent, and the faint sound, like breath drawn through stone, coming from somewhere deep within. By the end of 1908, Saint Albion no longer accepted new postulants. The reason, according to diocesan correspondence, was cited as internal reorganization, though no such restructuring ever took place. Internally, the convent had grown unnervingly silent. Rooms once filled with hymns and bells now echoed only with the footsteps of fewer and fewer nuns. The east wing remained sealed, and the chapel was locked to the public. The local community, once deferential to the strange and strict institution, began to whisper of the place as cursed. In 1910, during a summer storm, lightning struck the southern dormitory roof. The resulting blaze consumed the entire second floor of that wing in minutes. But firefighters on the scene noted something unusual. The flames behaved erratically, almost as if avoiding the central chapel. Witnesses described the fire retreating from the structure's stone crucifix, coiling backward against the wind, and burning in unnatural, patterned spirals, loops, and one unbroken circle around the building's perimeter. Despite the dry wood construction and wind-fanned embers, the main chapel remained untouched. Its interior, later inspected, showed not even the scent of smoke. After the fire, no reconstruction was attempted. The remaining sisters were quietly relocated to convents in New Orleans and Georgia. By 1912, Saint Albion stood vacant. Mines claimed the stone walls, and the surrounding pine forest thickened, pressing closer each year. All that remained functional was the bell tower, which inexplicably rang twice in the summer of 1915, though no one was present to pull its rope. 2 decades passed, In 1931, the church issued a sealed directive authorizing full demolition of what remained of Saint Albion. There was no mention of restoration, commemoration, or even formal closure. The order came directly from a regional archdiocese, but no bishop signed the paperwork. Contractors arrived to find the walls half collapsed, the dormitories gutted by rot. However, when they tried to bring down the chapels, their equipment malfunctioned, stone drills jammed, a crane's arm seized midair and would not descend. One foreman quit after claiming he heard women whispering from beneath the floorboards of the building. No sub-basement remaining, and access to the lower levels had long since been destroyed by the 1910 fire. Eventually, demolition was halted, the property was declared unstable, and the ruins left to nature. The land passed through several private owners, none of whom ever developed it. A hunting lodge proposed in the 1950s was abandoned after 2 workers went missing during a survey. Locals refused to speak about the site after sundown. Children dared one another to cross the rotted chapel threshold, but few ever did. In the 1980s, aerial photographs commissioned for a state development survey showed the land overgrown and undisturbed, but beneath the tree cover, strange geometric shadows could be seen. Satellite imaging revealed subsurface voids, perfect rectangles, approximately the size of small rooms, evenly spaced and located precisely where the convent's foundation once stood. Soil samples taken near the eastern edge showed unnatural compression, as if the earth had been weighed down by something dense and hollow, yet no trace of stone, brick, or concrete was found. Among the last living people to recall Saint Albion was Samuel Beach, a retired seminarian who had grown up on a farm less than a mile from the convent grounds. In a taped interview recorded in 1990, he spoke of recurring childhood dreams involving women in pale veils walking barefoot through the forest. He called them the brides without faces. They never looked directly at him, gazed, but always moved in slow procession toward the tree line, hands clasped, trying to sing without mouths. He remembered the sound vividly, no melody, but a low hum of breath and longing, vibrating like glass under tension. The dreams stopped only after the convent was torn down. Beach passed away in 1992, 2 years after the interview. His last written note, scribbled in the margin of his personal Bible, read, "They are still singing. I just don't know who they're singing to." Today, the Saint Albion property remains unmarked and undeveloped. Wild roses grow near where the chapel steps once stood. On mist-heavy mornings, hikers have claimed to hear distant bells ringing from somewhere within the pines, bells that never echo and always stop before they can be traced. The forest had taken nearly everything. Where the chapel once stood, only a depression in the earth remained, choked with pine needles and cypress roots. Wild moss covered what little foundation stone was left, and not even a single cross or nameplate marked the place. Birds avoided the site, so did deer. In satellite images, it appeared as a darker patch of green, circular and dense, as though the trees there aged faster or carried something the soil couldn't forget. By the mid-20th century, the story of Saint Albion had become less of a scandal and more of a whispered regional myth, something half remembered by old women lighting candles for daughters who never wrote back. Most of the church's surviving records had been relocated to diocesan holdings in Baton Rouge, but one building remained in Pine Hollow, a modest archive annex behind the rectory, untouched since 1933. It was there, in a drawer labeled Festival Liturgies, Regional, that a deteriorating reel-to-reel tape was discovered in 1981 by a seminary intern assigned to preservation duty. The reel was unmarked save for a paper slip, reading choral rehearsal March 1954. The intern logged it, auxed it, and sent it to be digitized with downscenes of others. When technicians played the audio, they expected static, or at best, an out-of-tune parish youth choir. What they heard, instead was 13 minutes and 22 seconds of low, murmuring chant. The voices female, unaccompanied, and uneven repeated a single Latin phrase, again and again, with no melody and no structure. Veniet sponsus, the bridegroom comes. Audio analysts from the seminary were brought in. No background noise could be identified. No acoustic signature matched the chapel or any known choir hall. The tape bore no production marks, no magnetic signature to suggest recording equipment had been used. Stranger still, the voices didn't behave like a choir. Some fell behind, others whispered with dry, breaking tones. A few spoke rather than sang, but all repeated the same 3 syllables, veniet sponsus. Linguists identified the pronunciation as ecclesiastical Latin, but the canes felt older, pre-medieval, as if adapted from some other liturgical root. Phonetic analysis revealed one voice that began the chant and ended it, slightly louder than the others. It belonged to no known individual. Attempts to filter the audio for environmental details only deepened the mystery. There was no reverb, no ambient echo. The recording sounded impossibly close and impossibly sealed. The reel was eventually filed under anomalous liturgies and placed in restricted storage. The church made no public statement. The tape has never been aired, but a transcript of the chant has circulated quietly among certain theological circles. Most dismiss it as an artifact of confused cataloging, the misrecorded novena, perhaps, or a hoax, but others recall the context of the phrase, veniet sponsus, the bridegroom comes. In monastic terms, the groom is Christ. In sacramental language, it signifies the final marriage of soul to eternity, but such language is symbolic until it isn't. No graves were ever found on the Saint Albion grounds, not a single marker. No death certificates were filed for the 31 girls who passed through its doors. The church issued no calls for canonization, no mention of martyrdom, no missionary posts, no transfers. Only their first names remain, entered in ink beside dates of final vow, always aligned with the dark of the moon. One private letter from a deacon assigned briefly to Pine Hollow in 1955, never mailed, found among his belongings after death, contained a drawing of a chapel floor plan, annotated with symbols that matched no liturgical function. In the margin he had written, "They were not sent to heaven. They were taken somewhere else. The groom is not who we think." In 2003, a remote sensing team conducting unrelated environmental research in rural Louisiana recorded an underground anomaly near the Saint Albion site. Subsurface scans revealed hollow space still rectangular, still evenly spaced, still empty. When asked to comment, a spokesperson for the archdiocese declined, stating only, "There is nothing of concern beneath Saint Albion. Its story is closed." But in local legend, something else persists. Hikers who camp too close to the edge of the woods report the sound of faint music late at night, not melody, but overlapping voices repeating something unintelligible. Dogs refuse to enter the glade where the chapel once stood, and each year, on the spring equinox, a resident reports seeing flickers of candlelight between the trees. Of the 31 girls, nothing physical remains, only parchment, only veils, only silence. And the question no one has yet dared to answer aloud: if they were brides, where did their groom take them?